Hello, welcome to the Lambda Bible Studies channel. We're continuing Carlisle Day, and for me, this is very exciting. Partly just because of my guests, partly because of the text we're looking at. I think we're going to have a fantastic stream. Before we get going, and we're going to be looking in particular at Lecture 4 from Carlisle's On Heroes series of lectures. Let's go around the panel and just give a word or two about your thoughts on Carlyle, or your thoughts in particular about his lecture series that we're looking at, or this particular lecture we're going to be looking at today, Lecture 4, The Hero as Priest, where he investigates Luther, the Reformation, Knox, and Puritanism. Furious Pertinax, why don't you go first?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Lambda, for having me on the your channel. And yes, Carlyle is someone I suppose we've talked about him in broad terms in our circles a lot in recent times, but I've only been relatively introduced him specifically in terms of the text for Carlyle Day. And I was obviously on last night with AA when we did the quotes. And one thing I did like about Carlyle, often what can happen with intellectuals is they sort of have a tendency, particularly as we progress more into the modern era, they sort of become a bit more flowery and sometimes a bit more politically correct, and they might disguise language or might be backwards in coming forwards, let's say. Carlyle never suffers that syndrome, which is of astonishing relief, actually. It's very, and for someone who's studied a lot of history, as I have done, it's actually quite relieving to read someone who's very plain their thinking. I mean, even if his language is complex, his ideas have clarity, and they certainly would agitate people. But I guess in part that's half the charm of Carlyle. Inversely, one thing I do like about Carlyle is he does revere the concept of heroism, and I think as we all understand, as probably most of our viewers do, that sort of heroism in the classical sense that we've all sort of grown to understand and love is something very much eschewed in the modern day, and Carlyle is absolutely a champion of it, conceptually speaking.
Thank you. Stray F, I think it's your first appearance on my channel, so welcome to Lambda Bible Studies. Have you got any thoughts for us as we begin?
I do, and thank you very much for having me, Lambda. I'm happy to be here. Unlike some of the other VIPs on the panel, I'm just kind of a humble Averite Christian, you might say, in that I'm an attendee of Lambda's Bible Studies and an active user of the Discord server. But Carlyle was very important for me personally to appear on, because this text particularly, although not necessarily this chapter, but certainly this text, is part of why I became a Christian, and why I returned to Christianity, to Catholicism, strangely, for what we're reading today, actually. But it was through his capacity to revive the conception of the heroic in multiple forms. To me, it kind of all pointed in the same ultimate direction, which was towards Jesus. And the significant thing was that Carlyle doesn't have to tell you about Jesus. He tells you about 20 different people. I mean, well, not 20 in this text, but he tells you about some 20 different people who can all point to some aspect of metaphysically coherent virtue. And through there, you get to, or at least I got to, what I think is the right conclusion. So this is a profoundly significant text in my life, and one I have spent quite a bit of time thinking about.
Thank you very much. British Berean.
Hello. I'm delighted to be back. I have poured myself a hearty glass of scotch in memory of the long deceased Scotsman that we're talking about today. I've only started reading Carlyle in the last year as well, actually, but I really enjoy his writing. I think one thing I really like about him and the way he gives these lectures in particular is that so many times when people deal with history, they'll approach it like a surgeon in the operating theatre, sort of carefully stitching one stroke and cutting one cut, whereas Carlyle somehow sort of addresses it like the Tasmanian devil, coming in, ripping everything apart, and yet somehow the patient ends up well and better than well on the far side. He really brings back the spirit of the people in history before your reading eyes, which I really appreciate.
Yes, what a wonderful characterization. And last but not least, Dave, how are you doing? And what are your thoughts on Carlyle?
Hello, thanks for having me. Well, I guess I'll say a few things. Is that I've enjoyed reading Carlyle, and I say that because I'm not going to say that I really love the language. I find he translates a little bit difficult into how modern people process things. I do think he's sort of a seminal thinker, and he was widely recognized in his time for being a master of the English language. His style is just not a very 20th century style. As a matter of fact, it's quite the opposite, sort of everything that we're not supposed to do in 20th century language. But that being said, the text we're doing now, I think, is really good. And I understand now, I think now on my second reading of this, more than I did before, why people say that you should start with heroes and hero worship as an introduction to Carlyle. You see here very clearly distilled a few very sharp ideas about the nature of heroism inside the individual soul. And then that's sharpened even further into sort of one of Carlyle's most famous historical approaches, which is very unfashionably an attack on our very deterministic concepts of history. Everyone was sort of introduced to this struggle of sort of the individualistic versus deterministic view of history, probably either in high school or in college. And always the background radiation of this debate is that all the intelligent people are really determinists, and the sentimental fools are the people who believe in heroic individuals steering history. I don't know. I think this might be a historical fad of the 20th century, because as Carlyle lays it out in this in particular, if we go through it more, you see sort of these moments in history that you can't really explain without reference to heroic moments. I remember a professor lecturing on his deterministic view of history, but then he always has some caveats like, well, if Philip the Macedon hadn't lived, our world just wouldn't exist. Okay, but, in that case, you want to tug on that thread a little bit. And of course, it never does get tugged on. But in Carlyle, I think you do see sort of the thread of historical heroism being tugged on, and then, not just leaving it as an abstract theory. There's sort of a map in this work that kind of shows you how that nature exists as an element in most people's personalities that we can kind of tap into and bring into our own lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've grown my own Carlyle beard just for the occasion, and I would remind, we have more people watching my channel than normally. So if you aren't a regular around these parts, do remember to subscribe. Let me bring up what I've got for us today is the entire text, but fear not, we're not going to read the whole thing. But I would like to dive a little bit deeper into it than you might expect. I want to go through really at high speed every single paragraph to give you the flow of the text. There's lots. I mean, it's crammed full. Every sentence is bringing a new idea to the table. So even here, it's just going to be a skim. But do people on the panel do interrupt me if there's something you want to draw particular attention to as we go through. So he starts out with this description of priests as being similar to prophets, which is maybe something we can discuss a little bit more later. But it feels like he's talking about priests as bringing religion down to the commonplace and helping people to feel it in their day-to-day lives. But in more violent times, there is this need for the priest to meet the moment, and potentially, if things take a more violent turn, it is the priest who becomes obviously heroic at that moment. Now, a lot of people see the potential for incremental reform. Perhaps if there's issues in society, we can just a little bit at a time improve things. But here we see Carlyle sad to realize that, unfortunately, we can't reach true change that way. There comes a point at which there is this need for a sudden dramatic reversal, a revolution, and we're going to see he's working towards a particular discussion of Martin Luther. I mean, I think you guys chip in if you have any comments on this, but I think this lecture as well as being a continued discussion of heroism, he's also bringing out his feelings about the Reformation. He's got quite a complicated feeling towards it, because many of the things that he despises, liberalisms and wars and the French Revolution and things, he sees them springing from the Reformation, and yet he gives quite a stout defense later on in the essay to Protestantism. Anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would say the thing that is important to sort of temper his obvious criticism of the French Revolution and Enlightenment liberalism is to look as a little bit later in the text at where he talks about the character of Luther particularly, and perhaps the character of Knox particularly, and not so much the Reformation as an event, but the spirit that animated the actors of it.
Yeah. By the way, these red notes and the highlighting is mine and not original to Carlyle, so take it all with a pinch of salt. He discusses here how individual thinkers will inherit a lot of their thinking from their fathers and grandfathers, but ultimately will inevitably discover new truths and in some ways add them on, and in some ways discard parts of what they've taken onto themselves. And again, he reiterates the need for this explosive moment of revolution, in particular motivated by the fact that if your reasoning, if your thinking and beliefs drift from reality, your practices will become stale likewise.
I think his description of that that historical moment between Dante and Luther was almost the spiritual counterpart to what Gaetano Mosca says with respect to like the political formula of ruling elites, that people become disillusioned with a political formula, and Carlyle seems to be talking about the people almost becoming disillusioned with a spiritual formula as such, that the constructions which were that were easily accepted when Dante was writing Divine Comedy were no longer acceptable to the populace of Luther's time, and that kind of negative space permitted this new energy in a man like Luther to burst forth into the space that had been freed up. I don't know if anyone else had considerations on that comparison.
I think we should keep on with the text, but I have many.
We will see.
I think that's a
Dante
little bit
appear
down
again
in the
a second,
weeds.
I think.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're
Yeah.
looking for broad sort of strokes that aren't the broad stroke, I think in this essay is the key role of the hero being sincerity.
Yes.
And that being sort of not simply the sincerity is not simply the it is the key role of the hero, perhaps altogether, but it's the key priestly role of the hero. The priest's main virtue is sincerity, and it's through the priest's sincerity that he attains a heroic nature. And I think that is the thesis that links together Dante with Luther. They're in many ways oppositional characters, but what people remark upon when they read Dante is that he just has this cosmos that's 100% sincere. There's no irony, and there's also no mysticism attached to it. You're not talking to like an ignorant peasant who believes this. You're talking to sort of a sophisticated person that sincerely beholds a cosmos in front of them and is describing it as matter-of-factly as someone might describe the stars that they see, which is also how he ends all of his cantos, all of his volumes. Pardon me, but I'm sorry. We should probably go back to the text.
Yeah, so we keep trucking on, and it's great to have these themes be brought up in our listeners' minds, because we will then see them appear in the text as we go through. But yeah, this paragraph describes this idea that how can it possibly be that previous generations were entirely wrong and yet we've suddenly arrived at truth? Interesting question. And then he kind of arrives at his conclusion, which is that, and this is quite an interesting commentary on the whole flow of the the fact that he finds heroism in Odin in the first lecture, and he finds heroism in Muhammad in the second lecture, and then turns to Christianity, and there's this universalism within Carlyle that he kind of draws all these trends together. Of course, from a Christian perspective, we might want to bring a different answer to that question. Now he comes to an interesting problem here, because he's previously talked about paganism in a positive light, and then he realizes that one of the key things that priests spend their entire time doing in almost all parts of the world is smashing idols and paganism, and decrying paganism. So how can he reconcile these things? And his solution is that, and this goes to what Dave, you were just saying, the real issue in idolatry is when you're insincere. So if you're worshipping an idol and you truly believe it to be divine, that's actually not idolatry. And he even goes so far as to say that the Puritans have a confession of faith, which is a representation of the divine, and so even the Puritans are engaged in some kind of idolatry. And he then says, worship of idols is at least better than nothing. Dave's having tech troubles, I guess.
No.
Or children, who knows?
Just on that basis, just quickly, if I may, Lando, there's also an interesting thing which is apparent in writers such as Carlyle. Like you said, there's like this universalism. He's happy to draw inspirations. He's happy to use the Nordic and paganistic Odin. He's happy to draw from the Islamic Muhammad. And not a lot of writers are willing to have that intellectual honesty. To actually sort of see something, either from a divergent past, in say the case with Nordic origin, or in the case of a civilizational adversary, which is sort of mostly true with European society or European cultures and say Mohammedanism. And he's more than happy to do this. He's more than happy to look over the fence one way or another and actually draw accurate observations from them and actually include them in his writing. And I actually really enjoyed that about Carlyle. And I think it stands him out in front of many others.
So this is interesting about the whole paganism thing, because if you follow, there's always this conversation every year when it seems like most right wingers kind of have big conversations around Christmas, and the communities sort of intermix a little bit. And so there was a bunch of pagans who posted this kind of idiotic thing. This is always their line, and it's so stupid. And they always ask for the same thing, and it's always something the Christians can never give. And it's like this idea, like, oh, well, we respect you guys, so why don't you show us a reciprocal respect to our religion? It's completely, I don't think that there needs to be a crusade against European paganism, or we need to march into their spaces and smash them, or we can't politically ally with people who have different religions than us. But the problem is, if you're a pagan and the peace offering is always like reciprocal respect for the deities and the faith practices. And first of all, like, if you're a pagan, like, don't front load this. It's insulting. You know that Christians can't do this. It's explicitly against Christian religion to do some kind of like God swapping respect, where we burn some incense to your idols and you burn some for, I guess this is some kind of deep pagan mistake. But furthermore, for modern neo-pagans, I'm additionally insulted because they always front load this sort of alliance talk before they even convince me they actually believe in their gods.
Did you just come from a conversation with a pagan? Like what?
No. There was okay. I'll just explicitly see where I saw this morning. I saw this in Millennial Woe's Telegram. Okay. He posted this thing from the Golden One, and it's this absolute crap that like they constantly hear from pagans. This the stuff about like mutual respect. No, you don't. No, you can ask me to politically ally with you. That's legitimate. You can ask me to just a ceasefire. That's legitimate request. But this mutual respect thing is bullshit. If you want to start with respect, then start by convincing me you sincerely believe that Thor and Odin are actual gods and you actually worship them. If I see you sincerely worship your gods and I sincerely believe that this is not a LARP, then I'm not going to say that there's going to be an assertion of equality, but after that, we can start with some respect. But like all I see from pagans is LARP, 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 LARP. totally insincere approach to spirituality, and then a demand that there is some kind of like exchange of respect. Just no, it's not going to happen, right? And I just, before this gets front loaded into conversations, I just want to like make that announcement. Sorry to digress the conversation, but like this is every time this comes up, right? Like just pagans, like if you want any modicum of respect, just convince me that you actually believe Thor and Odin exist, and that you're actually engaged in worship of a living deity, and you're not doing this as some kind of affectation.
Well, I'm glad I've given you that space to get that off your chest.
It's nice to hear. I have some pagan friends, and I like to.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Good to have a little bit of a positive rebuttal there.
It's just frustrating because it's always the same thing, and it always is like the same. Like it's always the same response. It's like I'm so tired of having to repeat this.
Yeah.
Right?
Should we carry on? So Luther is now compared directly to other heroes, and that his smashing of the we may discuss what the specifics are, but he's not happy with the church of his time, and he's destroying those teachings in the same way as previous idols were physically smashed. Now here's this paragraph very interesting to me because it's talking about is the true product of the Reformation this liberal, individualizing, anti-sovereign, populist kind of movement? Is that what Martin Luther's true legacy is? And Carlyle comes down quite strongly on the opinion that that is a side effect that he's not responsible for, and he says this in a few different ways. But he describes the existing sovereignty of Rome at the time as being a false sovereign, and in destroying the false sovereign, Martin Luther is laying up the foundations necessary for a true sovereign to return. And he's, I think, strangely optimistic about that happening.
Actually, AA made a good reference in, I don't know if you super chatted or if it was just a highlighted chat you did, about how Carlyle had the highest of contempt for sort of false captains. I think the same frame can be used with the period of time of which Luther interacts with Rome. It's that same kind of mindset of you had this hegemon and this hierarchy that is sort of corrupted from within, and sort of Luther is a thorough rebuke of that, and in many cases a rightful one. You know, if you think of those angles.
Even the Catholics on the panel can probably see where he's coming from vis-a-vis Leo X.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I think most Catholics would see the Reformation as having been very positive for the Catholic Church, even if they disagree with the Protestant schism that ended up coming out of it, right?
I guess for the theology, certainly.
Yeah, I would say so.
The problem is that while there was a theological correction, it came at the cost of an enormous number of lives.
Well, yeah, a lot of death. But these are just temporary matters on Earth.
Now, let's discuss this. Okay, so he mentions in passing here that there are ages of greatness in which actually all men could be great men, which is an idea I'd never come across before. But you see great men in history standing out almost because they're isolated in a world full of lesser men. But if great men are characterized by their sincerity and their attachment to truth, when the society is living in truth, actually it's easy to be a great man and you don't stand out. I think I'm reading that correctly.
Yeah, just a very quick aside on that point. I think he would probably be talking about something like the age of Odin from like the very first part of the text would be an age where most of the men there are great. To me, it's very reminiscent of the sort of Spengler idea of a cultural stage versus a civilizational stage. And in the cultural stage and sort of the unformed stage, that's when people are great and living in sincerity. It's something like that. But anyway,
and I think we'll spot a white pill coming out of Carlyle later when he implies that that's going to happen again. So watch out for that.
Just on that point, Lambda, sort of, there's a great historical example I could use where you look at a nation like Rome, for instance. I'm talking sort of really ancient Rome, as in Republican Rome. When you have a society like that, which is on the ascendancy and sort of has the will and the the institutions and the infrastructure and the other circumstances that come along with a successful civilization, presents this opportunity for great men to arise. I mean, you think we're 2,500 years, sort of 2,800 years removed from that period of Rome, and yet someone like Horatius Cocles can remain relevant and remain alive in literature and in folklore. And for those who don't know the story of Horatius Cocles, he was one man who held a bridge. For those who are familiar with the Anglo-Saxons and Stamford Bridge, like the famous Viking who held the bridge on his own, Horatius Cocles is the same thing, except he actually survived, and he basically saves Rome. And whether that story is embellished or not, who knows? But if you then follow the story of Rome thereafter, Rome sort of becomes this burgeoning power, first a local power, then a regional power, then it becomes an empire across the Mediterranean. And stories like that don't remain alive and don't remain continually within the consciousness of a people if they don't have a purpose, which Carlyle harkens to time and again in his writings on great men, and b this point that within societies great men can arise. Rome, particularly in its early life, certainly sort of pre-imperial Rome, pre the empire, is one such example of that. I mean, again, if I'm to use an example from beyond Europe, if you look at like the early generals of the Rashidun Caliphate, for instance, like they're all heroic in their own way because they all fought battles outnumbered, and they have a high prominent place in their culture. You know what I mean? And look what the Arab Empire came from, nothing in the desert to sort of conquering an empire larger than Rome in 2 generations. So I think Carlyle's right.
Now, here Carlyle discusses something interesting, which is, can you truly believe in the hero and worship the hero if you also believe that people should be thinking for themselves and using their own private judgment? I've heard it put this way quite frequently. Wasn't it better back in the day before the Bible was translated into the common vernacular, when people would rely on their priest to just tell them what was true? Isn't it a disaster, the fact that we now can study the Bible directly? Obviously a question close to my heart because I run a Bible study channel, and to my delight, Carlyle defends the fact that he's, as he says here, that true great men don't shut their eyes, don't shut their private judgment, but open them and have something to see. That if you're following true great men, what they're saying will align with reality, and then your private judgment should follow what they're saying.
And whatever their choices might be under specific circumstances, they choose it of volition. They don't sort of throw themselves in, as you say, with their eyes shut. They choose that path.
Here he mentions, he begins his discourse of Martin Luther, and I have to say, Carlyle is a fantastic storyteller. You really feel the drama of it as you go through. He describes how Luther was born of humble origins, makes a very fleeting and almost skittish comparison to Jesus, describes how in suffering he was kept in touch with reality. And then there's this incident that happened to Luther when he decided to devote himself to God's service, and he was seized upon by this terror, this feeling that he was surely going to be damned if he died, and he felt like his death may be nearby, that there was no way that he could be forgiven. And he discovered the concept that seemed much more credible, that it wasn't based, as it put here, on singing masses that he could be saved, but on the infinite grace of God. I'm going through this a little quicker because I think there's less pertinent discussion out of it, but I wanted to summarize where these paragraphs go. Now Luther visits Rome and sees lots of things there that, as Carlyle describes it, the scene of false priests clothed not in the beauty of holiness, but in far other vesture. And Luther was this reluctant hero to Carlyle. He didn't want to change the world, but we see this inevitable march in his life. He's kind of coming towards this collision, and indulgences is the spark for it. He ends up let's skip towards the diet of worms. He's going towards this place where he's going to have this confrontation where previously people from the last century or so who've clashed with the Catholic Church have ended up getting burnt at the stake. So he's being warned as he goes, don't do it, you're just going to die. And he says to them, were there as many devils in worms as there are roof tiles, I would on. And then he makes this very famous speech, for it is neither safe nor prudent for me to do against conscience. Here stand I can do no other. And Carlyle calls this the greatest moment in the modern history of men. This is Carlyle standing on God's truth, on the truth that he can't escape, and saying, regardless of the fact that I'm standing against all of the earthly powers, I'm stronger in God's truth than you are on the devil's lies, I think, as it's put later. So that brings us to the end of the description of Carlyle's life. So I think this is probably a good point to pause and let the panel give their thoughts on Martin Luther.
I just want to put I want to put in a pin in the thing you said about a skittish reference to the life of Jesus. That's like the whole of the text for me, not just this part, but the entire heroes and hero worship that he's dancing around the life of Jesus. It seems like the struggle of Carlyle's entire life, perhaps.
Yeah, why is that? What here is the so he says, it leads us back to another birth hour in a still meaner environment, 1800 years ago, of which it is fit that we say nothing, that we think of it only in silence, for what words are there? This is the way that he feels like somehow it's unfitting to talk of Jesus.
I mean, maybe he's just trying to get there through lesser men, right? That could be one way of looking at it.
In this way, Luther becomes sort of a Presbyterian saint, right?
That's actually exactly what I was thinking.
It's a saint for people who don't have saints.
I was thinking of Carlyle's heroes in general as kind of a newly reformed sainthood.
The whole lecture and the whole series of lectures really reminds me of Hebrews 11, a chapter in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, which is a passage known as kind of the Hall of Faith, which goes through basically every or most meaningful figures in the Old Testament, describes how their heroic acts came out of faith in God, and that their heroic acts were different to one another. So some, fought enemies, some were priests or prophets, and Carlyle's writings really, in Heroes, really mirror that. I don't know why he never gets back to Jesus. It is almost like he's comfortable extolling heroes, provided they're not specifically the direct object of Christian heroism. Because in this lecture series, he's happy to heroize Muhammad, so he's comfortable doing it for those of other religious systems. So Muhammad, Odin, in his lecture on Hero as Divinity.
I mean, he can make them heroes because he doesn't believe in their true religious mission, right?
I think Nathan C.J. Hood's comment in the chat is the choice I go with in terms of explaining this. No, not that one, but that's pretty good too. That's interesting too. Yes, that one. Perhaps Carlyle doesn't want his audience scandalized by saying Jesus is merely a hero and not the incarnate Word of God. I think that's the sort of generous Christian interpretation, right?
I suspect the way Carlyle phrased himself was deliberately
ambiguous.
Ambiguous, yes.
Yeah, I'd say so.
So having talked about Luther's life directly, he then says that great wars, contentions, and disunions followed out of this Reformation, and there's been great talk about this, and it seems strange to charge the Reformers directly with this. When Hercules turned the purifying river into King Augur's stables, I have no doubt that the confusion that resulted was considerable all round, but I think it was not Hercules' blame, it was some other's blame. So he's saying, when you make these giant sweeping changes to history. If you're a hero and you act in the world, you're going to cause ripple effects that go in all different directions. And just because you were causally responsible for everything that happened doesn't mean that you are morally culpable. Like, you're causing good and bad inevitably when you make giant moves on the world map.
Yeah, for me, this is a really interesting question that speaks to sort of a question of revolutionary ethos in general. Like, if your spirit is true and the direct actions, the direct results of your actions aren't evil, how responsible are you for the sort of kaleidoscope of actions that result from that? I'm a Catholic, so I think it's pretty clear where I stand in the Reformation's case, but I think it's actually a question very worth investigating, and I'm not even sure Carlyle would always take the side he seems to take here.
Yes, I mean, I've also been known to, from time to time, make arguments, give voice to a certain perspective that I don't fully hold. So I can understand that you can't necessarily take every word of Carlyle as his final word on the subject. Here's the reference to Dante that was mentioned earlier. So in Dante's day, there was no need for sophistry, self-blinding, or other dishonesty to believe in the religion of the day. But he's saying it had metastasized, and therefore by the time Luther came around, the situation was different. And had Luther, I guess, been alive in Dante's day, he could have embraced what was going on in the Catholic Church at that time. He then says that he makes the interesting claim that actually, where is it? The concept that, alas, there would be no greater danger to our Europe than the poor old Pope's revival. And his vision for the church, for as much as we care about Carlyle's view of what the church should do, is that all of the good things out of Rome should be transformed into the new form. I think he views it like there was a period of Odin, and when Odin was around, all the heroes would have believed in him. But that time has moved on, and we shouldn't try and bring Odin back. We shouldn't try and bring Rome back. What's new now? It's I guess Puritanism or Presbyterianism or whatever.
There's a big bit of Whiggishness here, and I think Carlyle has kind of lapsed into this very 19th century way of thinking, despite himself. I think he's following a line of logic that he probably would reject if you kind of laid it out. Can there be no? I mean, what kind of immediate? I don't think he would believe that there can be no reversions or heresies or degenerations, whatever word you prefer, from the truth, and that the progress of spirituality has to be ever upwards towards heaven. As he said in the beginning, that's the priest's job, is to sort of direct history from the temporal to the eternal. But the motion of time can easily go in the opposite direction, in which case, this figure of Luther sort of takes a different dimension. I think it's very difficult to see Luther as an evolution. I can see him as a transformer, as someone who sort of was a catalyst for necessary change that just wasn't coming along and had to be regrettably fulfilled in this incredibly bloody way. But this evolutionary perspective Carlyle presents here as something that, I don't know, I think in his sort of ardor to lay out the heroic side of Luther, he's lapsed into the same kind of quasi-deterministic evolutionary thinking that, for the most part, he's trying to testify against.
Well, yeah, and I'd want to push back against the term evolutionary, because he very explicitly says that there's a need for this explosive revolutionary change. That's, I think, what he was setting us up to get towards, was that, there's this paragraph is talking about the idea that you're not slowly advancing towards truth until you get there. He's saying offences accumulate until they become insupportable and then are violently burst through, cleared off as by explosion. Dante's sublime Catholicism, incredible now in theory and faith, now since we're faithless, doubting and dishonest prestige, has to be torn asunder by Luther. So he's not an evolutionary move. It's I see it more as a pendulum in Carlyle's thinking, that there are these great ages and then they decay, and then there's the great man comes and restores the world back into truth, back in line with some new religion, which is, so he sees Luther as a completely revolutionary figure. I don't know if that's...
I just can't, I guess I can't, maybe this is just the inner believer in me. I can't believe, I mean, Muhammad is a good example as well. He very much fits into this sort of explosive reformer type archetype, but I don't think that this can be ultimately divorced from truth. If we're saying that there is this sort of Spenglerian cycle, then even these Spenglerian cycles could take radically diseased directions. You know, I mean, for instance, if I don't think this is actually going to happen, but if wokeism replaces Christianity and we have sort of a heroic generation of wokies,
God forbid.
Which is, actually kind of, it's impossible, because, you can kind of see why this is impossible. Because,
but you could, I think a more palatable way for us to view it would be that the initially positive Protestant movement has itself metastasized towards wokeism, and the hero will be somebody who smashes what has now become of that movement, cursed liberalism, and moves us again towards truth. So it's not that wokeness reaches its full wokeness in a hero. It's that wokeness is the degeneration, and then now some new Luther is needed.
Sure. I mean, I guess this is the way to sort of steelman Carlyle, is to say that unless you're moving with the truth, which is eternal, you can't have this historic, heroic nature, even if you're operating as the replacement of a part of the cycle. The heroic part of your journey can never be that kind of thing. It can never be. It can never go against the eternal truth, and the truth kind of gets pushed into the background necessarily because he's talking about these characters. A good example is Muhammad. I guess the way to steelman this is that the early part of Muhammad's life genuinely was heroic when he was essentially waging war against Arabian paganism. And then when the religion consolidates and it takes on its truly heretical form in sort of the Medina phase of Muhammad's life, is that sort of where the heroism starts becoming corrupted, and the sort of error of that spiritual move comes into play? Because I guess what I'm saying is that it's true that every one of these revolutionary figures emerges from a heroic action to replace a corruption, but they seem to build in corruptions of their own, some soon and some very far from their initial
this is just because they're
revolution. What?
I mean, this is just because they're men. They're not, they're not Christ. I mean, this is, I think something of like this sort of degenerate kind of cycle. I don't know if I borrowed that phrasing from somebody I read that's brighter than me, but that sort of cycle doesn't just play itself out in the shape of movements like the Reformation or Mohammedanism as it became Islam. It can literally play itself out in the life of a single person. I think Carlyle doesn't dwell on the downside, the downswing of it, but I think your point is well taken, that you can actually see Muhammad's life as like, in itself a microcosm of the same cycle reoccurring. This isn't, entirely my position, incidentally, since I don't really think Islam was like a good thing, but I think this is a good way of understanding Carlyle's conception of it.
I think elsewhere in the first lecture in the series, he specifically mentions that when he's talking about religion, he's talking not about creeds or confessions, but purely about kind of actions and the things that the men do. Which and so for him, it seems that whether someone is a Catholic, a Protestant, a Muslim, or a pagan is an irrelevant detail with respect to the actual rational formulations, the doctrines. Now, I would disagree with Carlyle on that, but that seems to be the take he's pushing for. So that then in different epochs, the hero is the one who is most sincere to the prevailing religion, or to the religion which most comports with reality, not necessarily what is like most widely believed.
You might say that Carlyle is placing a higher credence on the deed. He's placing a high emphasis on the deed rather than the creed when highlighting those examples.
Yeah, but I think the error is that he both seems to want to affirm some unchanging principle in reality, but at the same time doesn't see a problem in the fact that these creeds radically differ from one another. And so if you are a sincere hero in one era and you follow one creed, and someone else is a sincere hero in another era with another creed, that means that the underlying sort of reality must have changed between those two eras. Otherwise, they couldn't have been fully sincere.
Well, and this is the thing missing from Carlyle's entire thought, is the fact that he doesn't actually have a rock to set his faith on, and therein is the entire problem, because it's just, I mean, it's somewhat incoherent, even if you're not actually a Christian, to say that Odin and Muhammad were doing the same thing somehow. They might have been manifesting the same aspects of the same thing in terms of their will and their and deeds, but it's towards entirely different ends, I think.
By all means, Lambda, if we don't have the time to canvass this, we can place it aside. But I just want to actually ask a bit of a question regarding this, because Dave did raise quite pointedly the Ridda Wars, which Muhammad waged against the fellow Arab tribes and sort of unified them into Islam. And what I did want to ask is, because I did admit to being a relative newcomer to Carlyle, despite having done research for today, is that, does Carlyle make a distinction when he mentions the revolutionary sort of form of, like this bursting energy, sort of either renewal or this sort of rising of a heroic figure in a revolutionary form, with the sort of all the energy and all the urgency that sort of comes with a figure like Luther and Muhammad? Does he make a distinction in his writing between that person coming from within, say, for example, in the way that Constantine came from within Rome, or that sort of Luther came from within Christianity, and say in the context of a Muhammad who sort of came from beyond, or say for example a Sultan Mehmed who came from beyond and into a sphere? Is there a distinction that Carlyle makes between the inner and the outer in that respect?
And this kind of gets all this to add to that question, because when I was reading this, I was thinking, I wonder if Genghis Khan would be a heroic Carlylean figure, right? And it's hard to even figure out how they fit in, right? He was very sincere.
Yeah. Good question, Dave. You hit it on the head. Exactly.
Well, I don't know. It's a good question.
I think
maybe
one of
that can speculate for us. Well, sorry, Ghost Ray.
Oh yeah, thank you. I think one of the things that I like to do when I'm reading this text is that I like to think. So I wasn't thinking about Genghis Khan. That's a really funny example, actually. But I like to think: is there anybody in the 20th century, which Carlyle had the good fortune not to see? Is there anyone in the 20th century that Carlyle would have cast as a hero? And I'm not a real genius in terms of historical things. I'm not super educated on this question, but I'm thinking like FDR in some bizarre and twisted way, maybe. Borrowing from Moltke's conception of like FDR as sort of the single and unifying will that changed the nature of the United States. But I really think you can look at the logic of, if you only look at the logic of the deeds and the accomplishments, you can basically cast almost anybody in that lens. And this is why Carlyle was able to do it.
The person who comes to mind for me is Lenin.
Oh God, yeah, no, that would work. Yeah, that's similarly, like, to us, I think intuitively ridiculous. But Carlyle makes mention, not in this part of the lecture, or the text, but in other lectures, to people like Rousseau and Napoleon, and they're similarly probably not heroes to any of us here, I don't think. So I think the thing that you really can never let go of is sort of the sincerity, and this is why I mentioned very, very much earlier the questions of Luther's personal character and Knox's personal character that come up in this, and that they sort of have, as far as men can have, pretty sterling characters.
Well, there are some key differences here because, and I want you to go further in the text, so I'll make this brief. It's very obvious that Muhammad was a priest, and but Genghis Khan was not. And so these things, you can't just carry these things over necessarily so easily.
Yeah, there's always this push and pull with trying to understand the sweep of history, isn't there, between finding generalizations that work so we can get our brains around it versus sanding off all the edges until it's no longer even a picture of reality. And of course, Carlyle is painting a very dramatic, romantic picture of individuals shaping history.
Well,
and in his conception, that's everything. The great men are the only thing worth wondering over. The bean counters and the general population are sort of a side note and to be contemptuously cast aside in your considerations.
Well, I do think that we should try to focus on sort of the priestly nature of the hero, and for that reason, sort of the toy example of Genghis Khan probably was a big sidetrack, right?
But Lenin might be decent because is he a priest of Marxism somehow? Like, there's something.
Lenin is definitely a priest of Marxism.
Yeah, so
that definitely is not. I think it's very illegitimate to say. It's very legitimate to say that he was a priest of a certain kind of Marxism. And he changed the whole concept of what it meant to be a Marxist or what it meant to follow communism. He actually made it something that you could have in the real world and wasn't just a toy of academics.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I think Lambda's example is the best one and also like the most horrifying one.
Yeah.
Lenin's that rare person who can add a methodology to a methodology to a philosophy. And that those kind of people are rare. As much as we might despise them, Lenin was able to do that.
You can see Cromwell that way too. Actually, again, not this lecture, but you could put Cromwell in those terms.
The only other,
a very brief mention.
The only other 20th century figure that came to my mind was perhaps Gandhi, in specifically the Indian context, because he's much more of a priestly figure than a kingly one, and had a similar effect on the nation in which he is most well known.
More controversial examples, because I think Gandhi was very much in keeping with the spirit of his times. I don't think he had sort of a moral revolution in so much far as he kind of continued one. And I would see him much more as sort of a Dante figure than someone who sincerely believed. Like Gandhi's role is just, he's famous for just so sincerely believing in the religion that the elites, international elites in the West actually professed.
Yes, I mean, I'm not trying to say that
seriously.
Gandhi's a good figure.
Dante was a hero in Carlylean terms.
Yeah,
Dante was mentioned in lecture 2, I think.
I think that to me, I have to always defend Dante because I'm a very big Dante fan. But I think Gandhi was almost like Machiavellianism. I think JP Morris in the chat had a missing something here with the Fox residues. We're not really doing an elite theory analysis of all this. But Gandhi is an interesting example of where I really see, I'm with Dave on this one. I see somebody using the faith of the time and quite brilliantly kind of marrying the faith internal to India and Hinduism and the faith internal to the elite class and sort of whatever you would call that era of liberalism, and using that for a political strategy. Now, whether he authentically,
I think he was sincere. I want to put Gandhi down. Like Gandhi, that's why he's famous.
Oh, I agree.
Gandhi took and it's not, it's sort of this Tolstoyan Christianity that really was popular with the elite classes. This somewhat materialized from a Christianity, and Gandhi was the most sincere believer in that imaginable. And that's, in many ways, he remade the religion of the elites just by demonstrating how sincerely he believed it.
And he was also sincere in sort of his local Hinduism. I mean, he had all these sorts of like very esoteric practices that he followed very, very, very strictly, right? Like he wasn't joking around about that stuff.
Yeah, kind of to a ridiculous degree, but let's go on.
Really, yeah, you're right.
Yeah. All right. So there's a mention of the fact that Luther's revolution was very much bloodless at his time. Now, whether it led on to bloodshed later, but Carlyle sort of absolves Luther of any responsibility that, and goes into quite a heartfelt set of. It almost feels like a love letter or an obituary, a eulogy of Luther's, saying how. In no books have I found a more robust, genuine, I will say noble faculty of a man. Rugged, honest, homely, simple, rugged, sterling, good humour too. And then later, he talks about a most gentle heart, full of pity and love. Indeed, the most truly valiant heart ever, showing how Luther's courage was much more praiseworthy than that of a tiger, because whereas a tiger only has this fierce and cruel nature, and maybe his courage comes out of a lack of knowledge, but yet Luther fully knew the situation and just stuck to his guns. You really, I think, I mean, these lectures are setting these various men up as heroes, so maybe it's not surprising, but this it's quite a gushing outpouring of praise towards Luther, isn't it?
You're making the point quite accurately that what sort of Carlyle is summarizing here is the fact that Luther was cognizant of a danger and still acted with sincerity and purpose and courage towards what he believed to be sort of right and sincere in that respect. Like you say, like a tiger, a predator sort of acts almost with instinct. Although they might have courage in their own right, they don't have an intellectualized knowledge of danger and perception of danger in the same way that humans can. And Luther was confronted with that situation that he was, and still proceeded and accepted the consequences that came with it had it gone wrong. I think that's an important point.
He then says, in Luther's own country, Protestantism soon dwindled into a rather barren affair. And by contrast, in some senses, one may say the only faces of Protestantism that ever got to the rank of being a faith, a true heart communication with heaven, and of exhibiting itself in history as such. He's in particular says Puritanism, and then talks about in Scotland Presbyterianism as being the kind of the places where Luther's, it wasn't Germany, but it was in I guess the United States and in Scotland that the legacy found its true set of heroes to take it further, beyond merely the humdrum politics of the day. And that people laughed at Puritanism at the time, but now it's got these weapons and sinews. So who can say that it wasn't true if it's strong? Says Carlyle.
Yeah, I think it's worth I think this probably came up in one of the earlier Carlyle Day pieces of content. But Carlyle was a massive Germanophile. He absolutely loved Germany. So I think this for him is like this idea that the spark of Lutheran reform actually landed and was fully realized in England and America. I think he loves that idea. So I think that's one of the sincerest parts of this text from him.
Well, let me read this little section. Well, this is what I mean by a whole nation of heroes, a believing nation. There needs not a great soul to make a hero. There needs a God-created soul which will be true to its origin. That will be a great soul. So I think he's saying here, it's not that certain people are born with a great soul. It's that souls are born created by God, and it's when they stick to their truth and their origin, and this is the hero as true, hero as somebody who speaks and sticks to truth, that it becomes great and has this impact in the world. This constant push and pull between the desire for fakery and for worshipping things which are false, and then for finding true representations of the divine and pushing those forwards against the pressures of the world around you.
Also, just on that note, it's because funny because we're speaking about sort of Christianity and great men. Is that if you look at someone, for example, say Diego Delando, and for those who don't know who he is, he was basically the first. I don't know if he actually reached the. He was a bishop, or yeah, no, he was. He was the first bishop of the Yucatan, and Diego Delando used to wander the jungles of sort of Mesoamerica, and would actually come into contact with the natives, and actually was wounded several times by being victims of ambushes of natives and whatever. And he was actively proselytizing sort of in the midst of the Spanish conquest of Central America. And I mean, someone like Diego de Landa, who was constantly exposed to dangers and and proselytized Christianity under difficult conditions and suffered, and was cognizant of the dangers, kind of in the same way that Luther was, but still, went along the pursuance of the great man concept, the heroic archetype. Diego Delando possibly is an example of that as well. Embodying the holy man, but also sort of the warrior in some ways, or certainly a priest who confronts danger.
Who is that? Diego Delander?
Yeah, Diego Delando. Yeah, he was the first bishop of the Yucatan.
Ah, there you go.
Yeah.
So now we turn our attention towards Scotland, and having talked quite a lot about Luther, he begins to talk about Knox, and I think the story of Knox may be less well known. Does anyone want to give a summary of Knox's life?
This is interesting because I had very little knowledge of this person outside of Carlyle talking about him.
Yeah, and it seems Carlyle's impression is that Knox gets a pretty bad rap, that he had a bad reputation, that his listeners to this lecture, maybe when they heard the name Knox, would have thought of him as this truculent, bad-mannered, ill-tempered man who was rude to one of the dignitaries of Scotland. So let's go through it as Carlyle tells it. He starts by again mentioning this reluctance that is like the Campbell refusal of the call being brought to mind. This guy Knox did not want to be a hero, and he was kind of, heroism was thrust upon him. But as he says, our primary characteristic of a hero, that he is sincere, applies emphatically to Knox. So what happened was he was involved, not directly, but he was nearby when there was this. I think it was an assassination of some person of importance. I can't remember the details, but he ended up getting sent on this as a galley slave. So he was down under the decks rowing away on this boat, and he was asked to kiss an image of Mary, and he could not do this. He couldn't face it. So at great personal risk, he says, "This is no mother god. This is a pented bread, a piece of wood, I tell you, with paint on it. She is fitter for swimming, I think, than for being worshipped," added Knox, and flung the thing into the river. So he grabs this icon, which was offensive to him. He viewed it as a form of idolatry, and chucked it into the water. And he didn't get executed for this, and neither did his other prisoners. But it was this inflexibility to untruth that marked him out. There's a description here that he resembles more than any of the moderns an old Hebrew prophet. The same inflexibility, intolerance, rigid, narrow-looking adherence to God's truth, stern rebuke in the name of God to all that forsake truth. An old Hebrew prophet in the guise of an Edinburgh minister of the 16th century.
I mean, it's refreshing, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
Like when I mentioned this like in the last 3 streams I've been on, but I'm reading the Old Testament in the book of Samuel, and Samuel does all these kind of sort of crazy extreme things that for people like myself who've been in this atheism versus theism debate, the Book of Samuel, along with the rest of the sort of books of Kings, the pre-Babylonian exile, Old Testament is a frequent source of their, trying to catch Christianity out for its backwardness. But you look at these characters these days, and the reaction I have is just like, oh my God, this is just so refreshing. I can't believe that someone would take a stand like this. This is exactly what I want to see. And why can't our leaders be like this? I would be happy to sort of accept some craziness and accept some extremism, if only I could touch the sincerity that obviously is overflowing out of this character. It kind of reminds me of that show. This is someone that comes frequently up in sort of the reactosphere, but The Young Pope. But was it Jude Law? Was he the guy who played the young Pope? And Catholics just watch the show in Francis's papacy, and they're just envying this character that I'm not so sure if he's supposed to be. He's not portrayed as a purely good character, and he's portrayed as an extremist. But it's just so refreshing.
I think in our corner of the internet, the idea that we might be confronted with things that are not true, and there's a tearing inside of us between the desire to stick to truth, though it cost us all we have, against the desire to who cares, let's just go along to get along. That's a real battle that I think many of us feel, and it's getting closer to home every day. I think this heroism that we're reading about is a very real and could become a very practical question that each of us has to consider. Are we prepared to stand on truth like the people that Carlyle is describing in the face of what is obvious untruths? Putting your truth, for example, the concept that truth is subjective is now just considered to be the polite societal way to frame
I
it.
shudder every time I hear the word "your truth."
Yeah, I had a little bit of a reaction to that.
Ancients, I think this saying "your truth" was something that ancient people did say, but they did not mean it in the way that modern people mean it.
Yeah, it's been a very corrupted concept.
Is it safe to say that when it was used in a past time, it was used more as a context of perhaps, I don't know, I'm just merely speculating, but a notion of, say, inner revelation and arriving at something yourself and the pathway to it, as opposed to now how it's just used purely as a subjective kind of, answer all for perceiving the world as one may for whatever reason? Is there a distinction there to be made, possibly?
Yeah, I think that in the ancient context, it's like the truth that was given to you. Like everyone has a small glimpse of the truth. And when you talk about your truth, you're talking about something that's necessarily small and humble. And it was almost when they said like this person speaks their truth, they didn't mean it. What they meant to say is that I suppose that this person speaks truth. This person speaks truth is sort of more outrageously putting on airs. It's more ostentatious. This person speaks their truth means this person's revealing a small part about the life they lived. He's speaking of truth that was sort of given to him by life and reality. Whereas, in the post-boomer, post-millennial generation, your truth is basically just this element of narcissism, where the columns of past ages can be just torn down so that you can erect an edifice to the self.
Yeah,
it's also,
it's used as a construction for falsehood, essentially.
It's also go
the
ahead,
understanding seems like the difference between a complementary type of truth and a contradictory type of truth. So as Christians, we have the four Gospels, and in especially the Synoptic Gospels, there are often differing accounts of the same circumstance, which are all truthful but complementary. They sort of add different details, emphasize different things. And so you could describe someone saying this is your truth as in this is your portion of the understanding of the entirety of truth. Whereas when moderns talk about your truth, they're a root assuming that there is no such thing as a united objective truth, and that everyone's subjective truth is in and of itself like self-substantiating and it's fine if that contradicts what someone else is saying, because there is no such thing as a central truth.
I'm not as convinced about that point, actually. I think that it is true that progressives and moderns claim the mantle of relativism, but I've become increasingly convinced that this mantle of relativism is purely tactical.
I
don't think that they believe that your truth means that that they don't believe in truth, or they think that, you know, contradictions don't make, because the biggest complaint, like right after your truth, is like you're disrespecting or you're contradicting my truth is immediately followed up. You know, this is immediately followed up with so usually when people talk about my truth, it's actually part of an attack in modern progressivism to say, like, if you contradict my truth with your truth, then this is sort of an attack on the holiness of my ego. When we see the whole my truth being used right now, we're almost seeing sort of a hierarchy of deities being proposed. And the hierarchy of deities is always to put the speaker in the position of the idol, and the person that's trying to reach some kind of larger human reality in the role of the blasphemer. I think the relativism that it preaches is almost purely tactical and secondary to that central heretical religious end.
Yeah, I think it's hiding. I think the relativism is actually just hiding the fact that your truth always has to be like a little bit of a snapshot of something that's progressive anyway. Like it actually can't be, your truth can't be that, like, you know, Christ died for our sins. Like that actually doesn't work. So
yeah, it literally can't be. Like that's never something's true. Yeah.
But I mean, to me, that would just mean that they're, and I don't disagree with you at all, actually, that they're being insincere in their words in the way that
totally.
Say, like Carl talking about sincerity in heroes, it's that they're using a framing of words to mean something that they don't actually think, they don't actually act on, they don't really believe in their heart of hearts.
Absolutely.
I don't think this is a purely English language issue, as is being suggested. This is, I think, there are people, intellectuals, who have a genuine belief in subjective truth. In fact, without belief in a God, I think it's, in some ways, you are floundering in a world of uncertainty. But the people who are using those terms as their Mott and Bailey tactics, they're not the intellectuals. They're just using the confusion that's being sort of spread in the academy as a weapon against the people who have a grounding for truth.
Quite. They use the intentional ambiguity of terminology or a warped notion or warped definition of a term in order to sort of construct this false reality. Meanwhile, you know, for those of us who you might say aspire to the truth, the existent, the sort of unshakable, the you know, the truth as we understand it, we have to be more than willing to get our heads around disambiguating and defining terms with a degree of sort of intellectual rigor, because otherwise we will fall foul of the traps of those who wish to distort reality.
So let's keep going. The next thing that happens is Knox has this run-in with Queen Mary. This happens just after Henry VIII dies. So there's still this fledgling Protestantism, and he's confronting Queen Mary. Now, I think there's a battle going on in the minds of Carlyle's audience, perhaps, between the desire for monarchs and the desire for heroes. And are monarchs inherently heroes?
Point of clarification before we go on. This is something that's stuck in my mind, and I don't know if I just missed this in the text. Is he talking about Mary Stuart or Mary Tudor? Is it Mary Tudor? I thought it was Mary Stuart.
I think it's Mary, Queen of Scots, whose last name.
Yeah, Mary Stuart, right?
Yeah,
okay,
right. I'm pretty sure that's
Yeah, okay.
You'd imagine so.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Because that makes a lot more sense, because she would be a Scottish queen.
I also imagine the other Mary might have tried to get Knox killed.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very
modern English readers would not have been upset that Knox berated Bloody Mary. They probably thought he should have given her more of his mind.
Yeah. So he's confronting a woman who is very bound up with the identity of Scotland, and the reputation of Knox after this incident apparently was that he, because we see in the next paragraph, we blame Knox for his intolerance. But Carlyle says it was unfortunately not possible to be polite with the Queen of Scotland unless one proved untrue to the nation and the cause of Scotland. So he's saying in this circumstance, the monarch no longer represented the true interests of the country. So a real Scottish patriot would be against the specific monarch in this instance and would not be polite in this.
Against the monarch, or just willing to speak harshly with her?
Yeah, not against her. Yes, that's a good distinction. Willing to reproof her in what was considered an uncouth way. I think we should read this whole paragraph because it speaks so much to our time.
I know I mention this constantly, but like, think of Samuel and David, right? Or Samuel and Saul. Like the prophet and the king at loggerheads that's a frequent trope.
We'll have to do a study on First and Second Samuel because they're absolutely magnificent.
I was about to say the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. But now tolerance is a very prescient issue for our time. And let's just read this couple of sentences. But on the whole, we are not altogether here to tolerate. We are here to resist, to control, and vanquish withal. We do not tolerate falsehoods, thieveries, iniquities when they fasten on us. We say to them, thou art false, thou art not tolerable. We are here to extinguish falsehoods and put an end to them in some wise way. I think this is exactly the attitude we should have to quote unquote tolerance when it means we may not any longer speak truth.
You omitted the sentence after where he says, I will not quarrel so much with the way, from which we can surmise Carlyle may have been in favour of physical removal, so to speak.
Yeah, I was about to say helicopters is kind of what he's prescribing there.
He's like, details, practical matters are for other men.
I mean, I think what's really interesting about
there actually is. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
But there actually is a very pertinent lesson here, and that is, what we're facing right now is the right is totally defeated. We're trying to kind of come up with a conceptualization of ourselves. And sort of an ultimate temptation is just to kind of, obviously everyone knows that optics is just totally essential in politics. And that in so far as any intellectual space or movement needs to work, it needs to in some sense be an optic ship. But there are those who take this core truth a little too far and they just kind of want to go to war against any kind of crudity, any kind of irreverence and they end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If you have an essential truth, there are sometimes no way that you can. There's no way you can show it without being crude and without being irreverent. And in many ways, so much of what people like the normie conservatives complain about. They're complaining about the fact that we're tearing down the idols of the new religion, and I'm not so sure that there's any way that we can't.
No, there's no coherent way to do it and actually still have the things that we're talking about. I mean, I think the whole point of Carlyle's characterization of Knox and kind of Cromwell too, actually, is kind of against the sort of like pathological ecumenism that is instinctual to some people who are trying to generate something that's like a little bit better, and it's like no, this is not nearly sufficient. And even Carlyle, who is basically a universalist, sees that.
Yeah.
Okay. The next thing he discusses is the unforgivable offence in him is that he wished to set up priests over the heads of kings. I think he's being sarcastic here that it's unforgivable, because he then later in the paragraph concludes All true reformers, as I said, are by the nature of them priests and strive for a theocracy. And then this is the last paragraph. We will praise the hero priest, rather, who does what is in him to bring them in. That is to say, the ideals, the ideals that would make. So if the people who ruled your society believed in the true doctrines of God, then the world would be better. That's what he means by theocracy. So if we will praise the hero priest, rather, who does what is in him to bring in these ideals and wears out in toil, calumny, contradiction, a noble life to make God's kingdom of this earth, the earth will not become too godlike. So that's the conclusion of the essay, that the priest is bringing the world towards a theocracy, as he puts it. Any thoughts on this? And if not, I have many other things that I want to put for discussion, but we do.
Yeah,
only
in
have
that
10
paragraph,
minutes
just before the end, he basically reiterates his lack of care about the details of doctrine when he basically says Hildebrand wished a theocracy, Cromwell wished it, fought for it, Mahomet attained it. Hildebrand's theocracy is not Cromwell's theocracy, and neither of them are Mahomet's theocracy. They're entirely different systems with entirely different results. But for Carlyle, that's kind of an irrelevant detail. It's not got anything to do with the actual doctrine, or even really, it would seem, the resulting system. It's about the heroes who to work toward building it.
Yeah, Carlyle might hate this, but I feel like he's almost doing like a mechanical analysis of what a priestly hero does, as bizarre and counterintuitive as that is. Like, they're mechanically trying to get to the same general location, which is a godly kingdom in itself. But it's almost, and this is again so contradictory because nothing of Carlyle sounds like this, but it's almost a value-free analysis where it's just like, okay, if you take priestly plus hero, this is what they're trying to do. But then it completely omits the values in here that adhere to the sort of priestly message that's actually being brought along with the heroism.
To me, this is the curiosity with Carlyle, that he's trying to he's trying to describe a continuum through history and find common threads. He sees something admirable in all these different traditions and wants to omit the question of truth, in fact. So it's curious to me that in his striving towards truth, that he says every hero must believe that they are 100% correct and stand against what other people are saying. And yet Carlyle himself wants to be above the fray and not commit to whether or not any of these individual heroes. I mean, if he got together in a room, Odin, Muhammad, Carlyle, Martin Luther, and Dante, and said, "You guys all agree on the same thing, don't you?"
I mean, they kill each other, ideally, right? Like,
yeah. What does he actually think would happen? Would, as he seems to imply, Luther say, "Oh, Dante, your religion is what I was trying to draw people back towards," and Dante would look to Muhammad and say, "I see in you the worship of the same God as me." I don't think that's realistic. In fact, these people would be strongly opposed to one another.
I'm trying to imagine a UN composed of people like Muhammad and Luther.
I mean, it'd be a better UN, to be fair. But yeah.
But part of this
is
part of this is the assumption that these people couldn't coexist because their heroism is in dialogue with a particular time.
Yeah.
So you couldn't unironically be a Muhammad in the 16th century Germany. It doesn't make any sense, right? I think that's probably what Carlyle would say, is that individual to be a hero is to be an individual in dialogue with history, and the language is sincerity. And there's only some. Here's a good example. I mean, like, why can't the left meme? The left can't meme because there's no sincere dialogue it has with this moment in history.
Yeah,
like you can be a leftist, you can even be a sincere leftist, but to be a sincere leftist is to have your head stuck in the past. It's to be it's basically to be in dialogue with a time that's not going on right now, because the only reactions you have to the reality we see right now are reactions. The only sincere reactions you have to the historical moment we have right now are ones that that are basically can't make you a leftist. Now, going back to this, like, I think that, I think Muhammad was a heretic, absolutely. And I think that, you could imagine a genuinely non-heretical version of Muhammad, but he wouldn't look like Martin Luther and he wouldn't look like Dante, because you couldn't be unironically a Martin Luther or Dante in that time period.
But the question is, where is Carlyle's sincerity? Why was he not seeking out the unabashed, unashamed divine expression in his time and promoting it as unashamedly true, rather than remaining in his entire writing and everything we have recorded of him a vague deist?
I think he was trying really hard to get there, and I think, in the same way that I remember back to Evola Day when it was brought up that Evola specifically said you can't, and I don't think Carlyle would agree with this, but Evola said, whatever sort of metaphysical and esoteric thing you find and the path you go down, you actually just have to do it inwardly. I'm not sure Carlyle would fully agree with that. I certainly don't think he would fully agree with that, because he really wanted to impose his will, right? Very much so, or a sincere will. But I think you could potentially see Carlyle as having spent his entire life looking for the thing that he found to be sincere in the age in which he found himself. And, whether he did or didn't, it certainly comes out like he didn't in his writings. And I think that's a tragedy of his life.
Just one thing I wanted to say just briefly, because I did agree with something that Dave was saying, and I didn't want to break his train of thought, but it's what he said about the left was accurate, and it's that whatever it was that Dave says, I just forgotten about it, but I agreed with it, and it's that plus the left's denial of reality, and the fact that every time we hear an echo of their perceived their perception of reality, it is always through a prism of falsity or prism of dishonesty, and it's always subjective, and it's that combined with what Dave said that really is at the crux, that it's at the nub of the left can't meme. And it's because the real punch power of a meme is that it has to have a slither of truth, or it has to pertain to something that is almost heretical to the present hegemon, and the present hegemon is dishonest. So it's being able to undermine that dishonest hegemon with the nugget of truth, and the left simply don't possess that.
I don't know how it necessarily be. I don't know if it necessarily has to be against the hegemon, but it has to be sincere.
It has to be against
I'm just saying that is the case here. I'm not saying that it has to be that way. My apologies.
Why do early atheist memes work and late atheist memes do not? Well, because the new atheist memes were they were obviously with the hegemon in a lot of ways, but the early ones work because there was a certain brand of super phony, super undereducated Christianity that inhabited they
were sham captains.
Yeah, exactly. They were sham captains. And so, and everyone could see it and everyone could feel it. So if you were pointing that out, you were actually memeing. The problem is that we discovered sometime around 2016, probably a little earlier, that, when you're complaining about these evangelical Protestants that, are boomers, you're complaining about peasants. And so you can make these observations, but they're not earth shaking. For instance, here's a good example: the Babylon Bee frequently makes fun of evangelicals.
Yes,
and it makes fun of them in a more funny and lighthearted way than does the Onion. Even the Onion, the Onion used to do it, in a much more mean-spirited way. And why is that? Well, it's because you can't, in order to sincerely regard the evangelical, you have to understand that he's sort of a small figure in his own country.
Yeah.
And, so the criticisms have to be small. And so the only way that new atheism could survive was to lie. I mean, it could tell the truth and be like, okay, we're just statistically kicking the shit out of these people because they're culturally more dispossessed than we are. Or it could lie and say, like, there's a secret conspiracy of right wingers where, like, the Dominionists are in charge of the government, and like they can't meme that way after 2015 or whatever, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Dave. As I said, I didn't actually mean it has to be the hegemon, but that it just happens to be the case in this time that the hegemon are the people who perpetrate many great lies. But what you said there, I completely agree with you. You've summarized it perfectly. Exactly.
Yeah, and to bring that back to Carlyle very, very quickly, I want to say that in some way, if we don't find the truly sincere in Carlyle, what we do find is, like, in a lot of his texts, not really this one so much, but in a lot of his texts, he's doing the same thing. He's basically memeing on, in really, clever and brilliantly written capacity. He's basically memeing on, sham captains like your sort of low-level evangelicals. But I think we should probably wrap up.
It's time. Thank you very much to all of my guests for joining me. If you're new here, do remember to subscribe before leaving and enjoy the rest of Carlisle Day. Good night.